intermittently honorable Cable is presiding. We are called to order. All rise, or stand, or drop down in a beanbag chair of your choice. Everybody down. Me too. Can't believe I'm getting started by 9 tonight. Usually if we cross that threshold at 9 p.m., I just say, pshaw, and that's a word, pshaw. I say pshaw, and then I say scratch it. We'll try again tomorrow, but, you know, we're here. Gonna do the thing. I think we'll go until a little after midnight, and then I'll bring us around to shut down town. You are honorably sat. Everybody's honorably caked up and honorably sat. And we are looking at each other honorably. We'll replace the word respectfully with honorably. We are looking and admiring each other honorably. Gazing admirably, honorably. On this, our Tuesday, our 6 nice Tuesday. In the year of our Gozer 2026. Well, what's everybody have to look forward to this week? Collins, your band has a show coming up, and I desperately wish I could go. If you are in or near the Tucson or Phoenix adjacent area, and you have at all the ability and volition to attend a live music show, Collins' band Bending Light is playing for you, I believe, on the 20th. Correct me if I'm wrong, I often am. Also, feel free to share deets to the event if you got it handy. If you have good news to hear, if you have good news to share, we're always open to hearing that. If you need more, I have an entire list of good news to get through. Good news first. I know it's usually get through bad news first, but I don't really have bad news to share today. I don't know how everybody feels about it. You're allowed to have feelings. You're allowed to have thoughts. You're allowed to have opinions. I saw Graham Plattner won his runoff, which I personally think is exciting. Not a perfect individual, but we don't strive for perfection, do we? I do like that he is adamantly opposed to funding for Israel, that we seem to be forever wedded to, while they simultaneously are our greatest national security risk. Fancy that. But he won his runoff. I saw that as some good news, as he is ultimately going to be running against Susan Collins. Good news outside of that, just so that we understand that everything isn't total shit. Earlier this week, Monterey Park, California residents overwhelmingly voted to permanently ban data centers, which kind of helps set a precedence for other counties potentially impacted by the rapid onset of data center diagnosis that we would prefer to mitigate forevermore. Resource consumption, for those who don't know, resource consumption for data centers is kind of bad. Plus, they produce very little. So to say, use the word produce and associate that with something like positive. They deplete freshwater resources while emitting nasty carbon emissions and noise pollution on top of that, which is one of the primary reasons someone like Aaron Brockovich is going after them, which is also good news, I would interpret. I think that's fair to say is good news. Growing number of, cultural awareness about how to be opposed to those sort of things. And, if you're able to attend a city council meeting near you, if you're at risk of rapid onset data center, then you could be in a position to speak out against that. Before things like, tax breaks are volunteered on your behalf to those centers and all of the other carrots that are dangled in free enterprise. Beginning on June 9th, New York will be the first state in the US to require advertisers to include a disclosure on ads if they're using AI-generated humans. I don't know about you, I have seen at least 2 ads while watching Twitch that had I don't know, they pretty rapidly hit that that uncanny valley. Sort of like seeing the new Link in the new Zelda. It rapidly hits the uncanny valley like instantaneously. But I've seen ads that kind of hit the same thing where it's like, this is an ad for fabric softener and we're using AI humans. Fascinating. Don't newt. I read the newt and I want to boop the snoot almost instantaneously. Donuts, very good to see you. So serendipitous of us to have shared space together last week. For those who don't know, Donut is part of, well, like myself, part of V and Mad Routines community and a featured player in our activities last week. Very good to see you. Thanks for dropping in and saying hi. I'm running through a list of good news as we wind up to get into a couple of other articles for the evening. Also, hello, Tell. Good to see you too. I don't hear my music playing at all. It's not even registering. Next. Is it? Might need to find another playlist. My Winamp player doesn't seem to be producing sound. Could be a me thing. Could be a me thing. Let's start this over. That's more like it. Track is called Lovely Oasis. Ha! Entirely user error on my end. I think we've course corrected. I see the volume registering on my desktop audio. I think we can return to order. We are hereby called to return to order. Gavel down. I'm gonna have to get a gavel. Invest in a gavel. I'm adding a gavel to my throne wish list. Zombie, thus demonstrating that you can throw ass to anything, including this. Including this video game golf music. We'll do it. Have music, we'll twerk. That's the way of it. Donut, have you settled in okay this week? Returning to North Texas was kind of rough. I don't know about you, I continue to reconcile all of our like constant waves of positivity last week and then returning to you know, our individual routines, not without its challenges, though a diversity of experience is cognitively beneficial to us. It's part of what we're talking about tonight later, actually. But you know, when you get a taste of actually like communal living and not a total absence of responsibilities, because we were still responsible to and for each other, and project management, and goal setting, and sometimes keeping others, hi, I'm others, task-focused and oriented, you get a sense of like, hey, this is kind of how we're meant to live. And we're all able to use some of the time off that we've earned in the current system to get a sip test of what it's like to live in another system. And it was a welcome reprieve for a number of reasons, if nothing more than a social experiment. And again, may you find fruitful employment on your journey. By fruitful, I mean relevant to your interest and more than pays the bills. I wish I had command of more of a network to be of support to you, but hey, if you need somebody to proof a resume or practice interviews with, those are things I can help with, myself and many others in the community. Last good news that we read. I skipped by something. Oh, right. New York became the first state in the US to require advertisers to include disclosure on ads if they're using AI-generated humans. New York's synthetic performer law officially takes effect, making it the first state to require advertisers to conspicuously disclose when AI-generated human performers appear in commercial ads. It is getting harder to tell. Across the ocean, across a couple of oceans, New Zealand will establish 5 new marine reserves, expanding protection for some of the country's most diverse marine ecosystems. Illinois, the Illinois passed a law to severely restrict new federal immigration detention centers in the state. Chingalamigra. Lawmakers passed a bill that will severely restrict when immigration data, I almost said data centers again. Ew, immigration data centers. When immigration detention centers can operate in Illinois. The law, if signed by Governor Pritzker, would prevent the federal government from placing detention centers within 1,500 feet of schools, homes, daycares, parks, forest preserves, homes, or places of worship. Honestly, I don't know if that's a significant of a barrier since they tend to be developed in middle of nowhere USA anyway, like at least one that's in Texas. Hawaii implemented a shield law to explicitly protect providers and patients of gender-affirming care. Go Hawaii. Hawaii Governor Josh Green signed House Bill 1875 into law, which will protect both patients and providers of gender-affirming care from abusive litigation from other states. The new shield law will ensure legal protections for patients, healthcare providers, and people assisting in the provision of certain healthcare in which states where that care is legal. From the reach of states with civil, criminal, and professional consequences related to that care. There's a few more here. Park Slope Food Coop, one of the oldest food... It's a co-op. Park Slope Food Co-op, one of the oldest food co-ops in the country, voted to boycott Israeli products. Ha! The Park Slope Food Co-op, or Coop, if you're reading too quickly, which is one of the oldest and largest active food co-ops in the United States, voted to boycott products from Israel. The vote to boycott Israeli products garnered 67% support from the thousands of co-op members and is in line with the co-op's long history of political activism, which included boycotting products from apartheid South Africa. Now, this is especially cool. Independent bookstores in the U.S. are experiencing an unprecedented surge. Support your local bookstore. The latest numbers of the American Booksellers Association show independent stores expanding at a pace not seen in this country. Membership in the ABA grew by more than 500 over the last year, which admittedly is an org I did not know existed. And one of my family members is a librarian. ABA grew from 500 over the last year to a total of 3,417 at 3,783 locations, nearly triple what it was a decade ago and the highest level since the 1990s. We can no longer weep for society when people are reading. Please read. Tell me what you're reading. Tell others what you're reading. I always want to know. Mule deer became the first animals to use California's wildlife bridge. California has been constructing a series of wildlife bridge projects that cross state highways, allowing wildlife safety to cross without being struck by motorists. On May 24th, not too long ago, 3 mule deer became the first wildlife to cross over California's first wildlife overcrossing over a state highway. I'll try this. It was Siskiyou County in Northern California. What else on the docket today? Okay, I shared this in the Discord too, but I'll drop it in the chat for everyone. Good news that you can use. All right, first thing on the docket tonight is an article on negative emotions linking to higher trust in political statements, which is important to bring awareness to when so much media is written for entertainment versus education. Now, you may find a synthesis in some of the best intending, best meaning authorship, but I think it's sort of in our nature as storytellers to use emotion to persuade. And where that gets out of line is when you start looking at, manipulated media. Manipulated media, the verbiage doesn't necessarily have to be ascribed to like AI, it can be also ascribed to authorship of an article meant to use like heavily emotional rhetoric and otherism to, well, bypass what would otherwise be your executive functions and your emotional intelligence and do nasty things like reinforce biases that may make it harder to change one's mind. A new study published in the Journal of Cognition and Emotion suggests that momentary emotional reactions interact with political beliefs to shape whether individuals find information trustworthy. The research provides evidence that feelings of anger and sadness increase trust in political statements, while joy tends to reduce political confirmation bias. Because, this speaks directly to our negativity bias that we evolved with for survival. We don't love bad news, but we are more strongly attached to it because it helps us survive. Welcome in Sci-Fi. Are you telling me that's what you prefer to go by? Then cool, would also love your pronouns, and welcome in. How'd you find the channel? If you're new here, I tend to warm things up with about an hour of psychoeducational chat. Sometimes that's neuroscience news, sometimes that's social psychology, sometimes that's just reading a summary of a published article, sometimes metadata, sometimes new. Smaller, more anecdotal type bits of information, and we often play retro gaming. Lately, the retro game du jour has been Final Fantasy X, which we'll get to a little bit later. But I liked this one at a glance. I haven't read the whole thing today, partially because of time, but at a glance, it's tied to one of my favorite subjects to talk about, which is mindfulness practices used to kind of bolster our overall media literacy prowess and help us better qualify the information that we're presented before we share it. Bullshit mitigation, a great passion of mine. Do the most good, do the least harm, you know, that old trope. Also, I need a sip of brown. Let's see, where did I leave off? The research provides evidence that feelings of anger and sadness increase trust in political statements. Right, so working on our built-in negativity bias, which, if we're going back to the adage of Dr. Rick Hansen from Hardwiring Happiness, when he's kind of musing on mindfulness practices related to like neuroplasticity, he kind of summarizes something very sciencey into something very easily accessible, which I love, which is negative experiences tend to stick like Velcro while positive experiences stick like Teflon. It doesn't mean they don't linger, it's just their positive experiences less likely to stick because negative experiences, and that doesn't mean bad, is anything like central nervous system arousing negative experiences more likely to stick to our negativity bias because they were more conducive to our survival. And like social learning and what we pass on, that sort of thing. Storytelling as it relates now to the news that we share and propagate on occasion. These findings highlight how physical and emotional responses play a role in how humans judge the truthfulness of media. Information is more accessible than ever, yet interpretations in the news are becoming increasingly polarized. Social media algorithms often amplify emotionally charged content, which tends to spread rapidly and deepen political divides, and I would say doubly so depending on where you get your media. You can self-select to sources that are going to be more objective in their prose, like maybe BBC or Reuters. Ground news, if you're okay with that, they do use AI in part of their summaries to kind of show a balance between the media that's presented there, so you can get a fair depiction of what type of prose and rhetoric that the right and the left and more centrist outlets are utilizing, and then ideally synthesize your own opinion of that. Versus going to a single outlet and then just, taking that outlet's word for it. So like, the extreme cases would be like your Fox Newses, your former InfoWars, your OAN, the mouthpieces that are more or less news and surface only. Strong feelings on AI. I do too. Yeah, we've talked about that here before pretty recently, and some data that supported. It was a small group, so it's hard not to ascribe this data to something as other than just kind of anecdotal, but some evidence that supported that. It was a group of like about 70 college students, and they were monitored through fMRI and given some task management, a couple of projects to work on over time, and then brain scans run before, during, and after. And of course, you have your control group and then your test group, and then within that, those who were given the tasks and able to use like language learning models and really any AI they wanted to complete their projects, when given more cognitively demanding tasks later, were less kind of cognitively agile in their pursuit of them. They scored lower. Their brains and their myelation, their frontal lobes had atrophied some compared to the group that did not rely on AI use. And our brain volume is going to fluctuate anytime throughout our life anyway, but it was concerning that happened in such a short amount of time. Now, is that metadata? No. Has this been repeated and verified and substantiated across 100 other studies? No. But it is one of a handful because AI adoption is so new, and we're kind of seeing like socially deleterious impacts of that in addition to socio-ecological impacts that are deleterious, where, like so many systems that we participate in, it's the capitalists who benefit through a wild, fucked up amount of asymmetry, while the rest of us, ultimately slum it and absorb the consequences of, their profiteering. So no, I have no great love for, like we were talking earlier, data centers and proliferation of them and forced adoption, rapid escalation of AI en masse because, again, of the deleterious social impacts. But just for an example, referencing that article from, God, when we talk about that, 5-6 weeks ago, I think it was, where literal brain atrophy was noted in the group that relied on language learning models more to complete their projects versus those who did not, arrived on the other side of that experience with more robust networks associated with their executive functions. So concentration, problem solving, those things did not diminish. In fact, they strengthened, especially working in a group. Also, hi P. John, and welcome back, Collins. My favorite TV program, welcome back, Collins. So mention negativity bias and how most manipulated media, again, that's not just AI-driven slop, that is any prose written to persuade by means of emotional manipulation, exacerbates, arouses, and fixates on our built-in negativity bias, which we evolved with to survive. And so, from a most devious psychological standpoint, the prose is often written to attract and arouse, and influence readership and repeat viewers and clicks and so on and so forth. The danger of that minimizes one's ability to, access those executive functions I was mentioning that would give them some ability to tap into mindfulness practices and qualify the information presented to them before they accept it as truth and then propagate it, saying, hey, have you read this? Pass it on to someone else. The more they're leading into heavily emotionally led rhetoric, absent those mindfulness practices, the more likely they are to perpetuate bullshit, which is principally what I operate in opposition to, and why I'm so prone to revisit this subject. So confirmation bias describes the human tendency to favor information that aligns with the person's existing beliefs, which we like. The brain loves taking shortcuts and path of least resistance, neurologically speaking, especially as we go along and synaptic pruning takes place and older in our lives. We become a little more reluctant, resistant to change, but neuroplasticity being what it is, we can still proliferate networks associated with being open to change so that happens more easily. The work there is encouraging others to do the same. People often scrutinize or reject opposing views while easily accepting ideas that match their own worldview. This pattern reflects motivated reasoning, a process where individuals evaluate facts in ways that support their preferred ideological identity. From a social in-group standpoint, of course, we're going to want to share information with like-minded friends and, those with core values and ideologies similar to our own, but we also want to grow with them. We want to be challenged. At least I do. Using only one news source is very dangerous for our democracy. I agree. And diversification of experience benefits us all. Now, where do you like? No one has to share, but where do you like to go for your news? I still go to like Al Jazeera, especially for updates on, issues related to Iran, Palestine, things like that. BBC I still like. I use Reuters more. But that's not it. I mean, ground news typically will link me to multiple other sources too. Though I'm admittedly a bit squishy about using ground news now that I've more recently been pointed out that it does use AI, which it's so goddamn ubiquitous. The authors of this current study wanted to understand how immediate emotional reactions might amplify or override this political confirmation bias. They based their work on the affect in this case with an A meaning change, as information framework. This concept proposes that people use their current emotional states as a mental shortcut to judge whether information is trustworthy, especially when the content is ambiguous or politically sensitive. Maria Lisa Halko, a senior university lecturer in the Faculty of Social Sciences, University of Helsinki, explained the rationale behind the study. Her team wanted to understand the subconscious factors driving polarization. Polarization, good keyword to point out there, because that usually is one of the, if we're looking at like the methodology and the rhetoric and the prose of media with the intention to manipulate, otherism, polarization, a lot of hyperbolic verbiage and targeting of minority groups. Overgeneralizations are common. In fact, if you are like well-resourced in knowing how to pay attention to like cognitive distortions, you can start catching them in articles, and that can kind of be a tool to use to heighten your own media literacy bias. To start paying attention for things like, are they speaking in overgeneralizations? Are they saying something that happened once is happening all the time? If one person who happened to have mental health needs harmed one person one time, are they now saying that all persons with mental health needs are dangerous? Or all immigrants are dangerous, all trans persons are dangerous? Are they using one example to then hyperbolically exaggerate and paint with a broad brush? See shit like that. Pay attention to it. But that's one of several cognitive distortions you can pay attention to. Are they using like all or nothing tropes, black and white thinking, prose designed to, again, kind of target that polarization? Are they trying to divide an audience in their discourse? Public discussions about misinformation and political disagreement often focus on reasoning ability, partisan bias, or how people are persuaded by political messages. But politics is rarely just about facts and reasoning. And political news and information often evoke strong emotional reactions in people. She noted that the researchers wanted to investigate if these feelings were correlated with perceptions of truth. We were interested in whether emotional responses are associated with whether information feels true or trustworthy. More specifically, we wanted to understand how emotions may shape trust in political information among people with different ideological views. The research took place at the Aalto Behavioral Laboratory in Finland with 62 adult participants. So, a small group here. The sample consisted of 40 women, 19 men, and 3 individuals who did not disclose their gender, with an average of 32 years. Before the main experiment, participants completed questionnaires to measure their general emotional tendencies, recent mood states, and their social and economic conservatism. During the experiment, each participant sat in a private room and evaluated 32 short statements. These excerpts covered divisive political topics like immigration, climate policy, taxation, and welfare. Half of the statements were factually true, adapted from reputable news sources, while the other half were false versions were false versions created by subtly altering factual details. Now I'm like running through, like, how many times have I said subtly out loud? Subtly, subtle, subterfuge. Yeah. The emotions were, God almighty. The statements were also balanced so that half favored conservative viewpoints and half favored liberal viewpoints. Participants looked at each statement on a computer screen for exactly 10 seconds. Immediately afterwards, they rated the perceived trustworthiness of the statement on a continuous scale, ranging from 0 to 100. While the participants read the text, the researchers measured their physiological responses in real time. They attached sensors to the participants' fingers to measure sweat gland activity. They attached sensors to the participants' fingers to measure sweat gland activity, which indicates physical arousal. They also used electrocardiogram sensors to track heart rate. Much of this almost sounds like they use like parts of like a polygraph in a way. Which the validity of polygraphs, I mean, they're not admissible in court because of their lack of reliability for determining truthfulness. At the same time, the researchers recorded the participants' faces on video. They used specialized facial expression analysis software to detect subtle muscle movements. This software provided frame-by-frame estimates of 7 distinct emotions, including anger, contempt, disgust, fear, joy, sadness, and surprise. That's all of them. That's every emotion. All that we'll ever feel. No emotions in between. No nuances. Cut and dry, those emotions. The researchers found that participants successfully distinguished true statements from false ones on average, rating the factual excerpts as more trustworthy. They also observed a strong, that's encouraging. That's actually really encouraging. They also observed a strong pattern on political confirmation bias. Less encouraging. Participants were highly likely to rate statements as trustworthy if the content aligned with their own political ideology, which I think we have a natural tendency to do that. Halko noted the demographics of this group yielded unexpected results. We were somewhat surprised that we found so clear differences in emotional responses and in their association with perceived trustworthiness, even though our participant sample was fairly homogeneous, and the stimuli consisted only of short written text rather than especially emotionally provocative material. Most of our participants were university students, meaning relatively highly educated, and many also reported following political news regularly. One might expect these kind of differences to be even stronger in more politically diverse or polarized populations, which we kind of see on display here. Given your flavor of social media and what you see, shared in those spaces. When looking at facial expression data, the scientists found that the specific emotional reactions were linked to these trust evaluations across the entire group. Subtle facial expressions of anger, sadness were positively associated with higher trustworthiness ratings. This is me wondering if, like, my own affect changes when I'm reading. Because, I mean, how many of us have, like, seen ourselves reading? Record myself reading all the time. I'm trying to look really cool. I don't want to scowl too often. Increases in the 2 negative emotions seem to make participants more likely to believe the statements they were reading. Those being of anger and sadness. Which is distinctive, but kind of speaks to what we were highlighting earlier. On like emotionally led, emotionally heavy rhetoric, articles written to, deliberately arouse those feelings to then reward them with information later and return visits to those sources. When participants displayed subtle signs of joy, they were less likely to blindly trust information simply because it matched their political beliefs. The data suggests that positive emotions might act as a buffer against entrenched partisan perspectives, which also suggests that, yeah, we have maybe some, at least from this group, we can infer like they have some kind of built-in buffer from having like the wool pulled over their eyes, or being suspicious of good news, I suppose. In this case, rightfully suspicious of good news in some cases. Not just blowing smoke yet. Our findings suggest that people do not evaluate information on a purely rational or detached way. Emotional responses can be associated with whether information feels true, and these associations may differ across political ideologies. They explain that human reactions play a meaningful role in cognition. More broadly, the study highlights that feelings are not simply irrelevant noise in political judgment. They are part of how people make sense of information in the world around them. To ensure the results were accurate, scientists controlled for several other psychological factors. They accounted for the participants' general positive and negative affect, their interest in politics, and overconfidence in their own task performance. The connection between emotional expressions and trust ratings remains consistent when accounting for these background traits. The effect should not be interpreted as meaning that emotions alone determine whether people trust information. Political judgments are shaped by many factors simultaneously. And really, yeah, I mean, it's not too much to measure. It would just require a much more robust study to take, like, cultural biases into consideration, and lifespan and development, what they were exposed to. It did qualify if they were college students or not. All of those things matter. At the same time, our findings suggest that emotional responses are not irrelevant, but a part of broader psychological processes through which people engage with information. Emotional reactions may sometimes reduce existing biases, while at other times they may widen the divide between different political viewpoints. Of the limitations, which we also always want to point out, one important caveat is that the study examined reactions to short written statements presented without source information, which differs from the way people typically encounter political content in real-world media environments. Yeah, it would have made sense, I think, to have sourced actual articles to gauge those interactions. In everyday settings, the source itself can be an important part of how information is interpreted, although it remains unclear how source cues influence immediate emotional responses. The author also emphasized that readers should not assume feelings destroy critical thinking. I don't think they do. I mean, emotions are teachers. We just want to make sure that our emotions are not being manipulated to where it would cloud our judgment, because, I mean, that can happen in any course of any experience where emotions are present. They view these reactions as standard psychological functions. Emotional responses are a normal part of information processing, although they are often difficult to measure directly and not taken into account in research and public discussions about political judgment. Or more accurately, people often say that someone is reacting emotionally to political news. In reality, everyone has emotional responses to information, including political information. The more important question is what follows from those reactions, that is, how they influence judgments and decision making. I think so, and how it's shared, like if they are sharing something, are they qualifying it with their own opinion, saying, take this with a grain of salt, this does not agree with information presented in comparison to another source, or for that matter, if the source has offered a retraction or got something wrong, do they in turn go back and say, hey, I believe this once, but this was wrong. I've now reconciled my association with that, because change is good, as is humility. Yay. The first experiment was intentionally designed as a relatively controlled baseline study, but the next step is to study more ideologically heterogeneous populations, and especially individuals at the ends of the ideological spectrum. We also plan to run the next experiment closer to an election period when political identities, emotions, and media exposure are likely to be even more salient and emotionally engaging. It's curious to compare this to like what we were talking about yesterday in the study on TikTok, and how TikTok was one of the more significant proponents of manipulated media, as the data showed around the election cycle in 2024 from the article from yesterday, if you were here yesterday. If not, I've posted it in the Discord. But what it was saying was like the majority of political content pushed, like if you were a new user on TikTok in 2024 around the election cycle, was almost 12% more likely to show you right-wing content than the 7% of left-wing content. And then that just got worse the more you interacted with that stuff, because that's how algorithms work. But all the same, it was concerning, following the forced acquisition of such ubiquitously used media outlets that quickly became another propaganda piece for our government. Welcome in, Carly. I just wrapped discussion on this article regarding our emotional mindfulness amidst readership of media designed to arouse our emotions, which is most of it. Feelings are storytellers, after all. We just don't always get them right, which is precisely where cognitive behavioral strategies come in to then do things like put thoughts on trial, separate ourselves from the emotion, and determine, like, okay, this feeling's coming up for me. Is this aligned with reality? Am I getting this right? So then we don't risk reinforcing a behavior associated with the negative emotion. Seems bad, so it must be true. Hello, Mikey. Welcome in. Our negativity bias can be a real motherfucker, but, we have so many tools. Well, those of us with fully developed prefrontal cortexes, which I imagine is most of us, we do have and even those, especially among us, that may struggle with executive functions on the best of days, we do have things like neuroplasticity and the ability to change and access mindfulness practices associated with those executive functions to then put into check sometimes what is, well, I'm of a different school of thought. I was going to say crudely referred to as our animal brain, but if you're looking at like the triune brain model, the earlier parts of our brain to develop for our survival, like where our hippocampus and amygdala and midbrain limbic systems are, they tend to fire, they fire and respond for our survival at a much faster rate than information would reach our prefrontal cortex, where, we typically associate executive function. To wit, we do this really cool thing. We have the ability to practice cognitive skills and develop new networks that help us kind of buffer the emotional messengers coming to us. By the time they reach our executive network, we can go, hey, let's put these thoughts on trial. Let's compare them against our objective reality. Let's make sure that the information we're perusing or being fed is qualifiably in our best interest. Is it designed to manipulate, persuade? And then in turn, if we're using those mindfulness practices, we're able to kind of soothe that midbrain limbic system. All right, we got through that. Now, it is, of course, kind of like part 2 of Mental Health Month. So with that, I've got some data on how to mitigate stigma for those struggling with mental health needs. In this case, I'm going to use the term SMI quite often, which, I don't know, in the 13 years I've worked in behavioral health, I've never used SMI like regularly in my verbiage. But you see it on like a bunch of official like federal documents that persons with SMI, serious mental illness, and that's usually a group of persons with like acute mental health needs like schizophrenia, treatment-resistant depression, PTSD, maybe even some of the IDD crowd gets lumped into that. But more difficult cases to treat that require more resources to make sure their needs are met, right? Material goods being delivered to those persons. So you'll see that term come up here, but I think broadly speaking, this is meant to serve as like community education, mostly for those who don't normally interact with, live with, or speak to that subject entirely. Meaning that once we wrap reviewing this, I'll share it and then you can share it after that. Welcome in Culture, thank you for the lurk. Curious that it doesn't reference the estimated population with mental health needs. So depending on where you look, it's 1 in 5 or 1 in 4. I think we're trending closer towards 1 in 4 persons who has a diagnosable or already diagnosed mental health need. And that doesn't mean severe. That doesn't mean they need to live in a psychiatric hospital. That means treatable and manageable and not dangerous, and they're human. Mental health needs are just part and parcel of being human. Wedded to the fabric, the tapestry, the poetry, whatever you want to call it, the existential promise of being human. More than half of people with mental illness don't receive help for their disorders. Often people avoid or delay seeking treatment due to concerns about being treated differently or fears of losing their jobs and livelihood. That's because of stigma, prejudice, and discrimination against persons with mental illness, and it's still very much a problem. I subjectively think it's better than it has been, but of course that's going to vacillate depending on any one given experience and what state you live in. It's like in my exposure to, say, like nursing homes over the last decade, like what treatment teams, how treatment teams, meaning like nurse leadership, administration, social services, charge nurses, the way they speak to and about their population with mental health needs has improved by what I've observed. It's less shaming, it's less othering, it's less stigmatized, it's less lumped into this category of problematic or dangerous. Stigma, prejudice, and discrimination against people with mental illness can be subtle or obvious, but no matter the magnitude, it can lead to harm. And yeah, I mean, the cases that are relevant to a lot of us is, most of us aren't telling our employers what diagnosis we have. It's at risk of being ostracized or other, like most of us aren't doing that, maybe with close friends, but even then with some trepidation, because we want to make sure that who we're sharing that information with is safe to do so, and they're not going to like even passive-aggressively leverage that against us. People with mental illness are marginalized and discriminated against in various ways, but understanding what that looks like can help address. Understanding what that looks like and how to address and eradicate it can help. And it matters, there's, so often is the case, cultural attitudes may perceive or understand those with mental health needs as dangerous, or somebody with like schizophrenia as dangerous, because it's a scary sounding diagnosis when someone with schizophrenia as there's just as much capacity to be prosocial and benign and whatever as any one of us. Point being, data supports that persons with mental illness are more likely to be victims of violence than perpetuators or instigators of it. Which can be a helpful little pearl to consider whenever you see someone having like a forced encounter with like police, or someone kind of rigidly approaching them, them in this case being a person struggling with severe or serious mental illness in public, and the community response is then poor. Often those interactions, when observing them, you can kind of see how shit can turn south fast if someone is absent, say like any kind of therapeutic intervention skills. Stigma not only directly affects individuals with mental illness, but also the loved ones who support them, often including their family members, which I bring this up a lot. I think it behooves all parties. If you suspect or live with someone with known mental health needs, sure, the onus is on them to be an active participant in their own mental health treatment, part and parcel to their access and ability to utilize the resources around them. The other component of that is if you share a household with that person, the work is on you too to learn about their diagnoses and how you can support them and create accommodations where possible and reduce friction in your relationship. Show them that you care and love about them to learn about the diagnoses that they're living with, versus just lumping it off as, oh yeah, you got depression, huh? That sucks. Don't be that partner. For example, in some Asian cultures, seeking professional help for mental illness may maybe counter the cultural values for strong family emotional restraint and avoiding shame. Among some groups, including the African American community's distrust of the mental health care system can also be a barrier to seeking help. Which reminds me, Stephanie Fu's What My Bones Know is a really good book on trauma that speaks to some of that, so at least one perspective. Growing up in an Asian community and living with complex PTSD, and most importantly, the treatment that they found later in life. Some examples of stereotypes and prejudices: public, people with mental illness are dangerous, incompetent, and to blame for their disorder, unpredictable. Which, this is where community education, psychoeducation comes in. Anything you ever learn here or from, say, like maybe a work training, anything you can utilize to shine a light and then maybe help others turn a corner or soften their perspectives. They're misguided or potentially maligned perspectives about an entire population. Perhaps they were fed some misinformation, like we were talking earlier, that reinforced their negativity bias, that then made them a little more prickly about the subject of persons with mental health needs. And you, good viewer or listener, are equipped with the psychoeducation to help them understand that they may be born more likely to have increased stress responses. They are not at fault for their diagnoses and what happens to them, or if they are victims of circumstance. We are biopsychosocial creatures at the mercy of our lived experiences. And while certainly we age into autonomy and self-direction, that is also coupled with a lifetime of social encounters that may have reinforced how the body seeks safety and what that looks like. Self-stereotypes and prejudices. A person may believe that they are dangerous, incompetent, or to blame, or carry some undeserved shame about what they're living with. Of course, institutionally, thanks to all things capitalism that exacerbates by way of exploitation, often creates the onset of a lot of mental health needs. Not all, but a lot. We could live in a utopia and persons with mental health needs would still exist. There would be significantly fewer of them. There's a discrimination scope of this. From the public view, employers may not hire them, landlords may not rent to them. Of course, this is illegal for them to do so. It still happens. Healthcare system may offer them a lower standard of care. Self-driven scope there, these thoughts may lead to lower self-esteem, self-efficacy, and why try? Someone like me is not worthy. So personalizing that shame and doubt, which is something that can be unlearned, but if socially reinforced, it doesn't make that any easier. Depictions of persons with mental health in media can also be problematic, so it's important to point out that any depictions that we see may lack in authenticity for the sake of entertainment. Media representations of people with mental illness can influence perceptions of stigma, as they have often been negative, inaccurate, or violent representations. We see this with trans persons in media as well, that misattributes violence, that misattributes their identity to violence. Think of like Silence of the Lambs. A study published by Scarf et al. In 2020 looked at a recent example of the film Joker, which portrays the lead actor as a person with mental illness who becomes extremely violent. The study found that viewing the film was associated with higher levels of prejudice towards those with mental illness, which we know, again, is not predominantly the case, but that is something that results in overgeneralization, taking one example of something, especially something that's fictional, and then applying it to a large group of people. Additionally, the authors suggest the Joker may exacerbate self-stigma for those with mental illness, leading to those delays in seeking help. Stigma and discrimination can contribute to worsening symptoms and reduce likelihood of getting treatment. A recent extensive review of research found that self-stigma leads to negative effects on recovery among people diagnosed with severe mental illness. There's that SMI I was talking about. How it impacts them by means of reducing hope, lowering self-esteem, which all of this is going to reinforce symptoms of depression, reinforce the worst symptoms of anxiety and self-rejection, and not the most powerful tools for increasing motivation for change. Or self-efficacy, like it was mentioning, like your article mentioned earlier. 2017 study involving more than 200 individuals with mental illness over a period of 2 years found that greater self-stigma was associated with poor recovery from mental illness after 1 and 2 years. Editorial in The Lancet, which is a journal usually publishes psychiatric data or research. Lancet notes that the impacts of stigma are pervasive, affecting political enthusiasm, charitable fundraising and availability, support for local services, and underfunding of research for mental health relative to other conditions. Some of the other harmful effects stigma can include reluctance to seek help with treatment, reduced likelihood of staying with treatment. Which, when I was a case manager, we saw someone like trying to give it a try, and then the moment a failed expectation was hit, they were much more difficult to rein in and help adhere to, like, their care plan. But rightfully so, given their experience. Results in more social isolation and withdrawal, lack of understanding by family, friends, and coworkers. This is why I was saying earlier there's an importance to, in any one household, to developing an understanding around those that you care for and live with, or even maybe like a coworker or a friend. It doesn't have to be somebody that you live with, but if someone has disclosed to you that they have, say, bipolar disorder or ADHD or autism spectrum disorder, it absolutely helps and communicates a caring system, and that you're worthy of communicating trust to by communicating back to them that, hey, I've learned about your diagnosis, here's what I've learned, does this happen with you? Because not all diagnoses are expressed in the same way. What comes up for you? What kind of accommodations do you like? If you learn those things and communicate that back, it's an excellent way to reduce stigma, especially if you're helping guide others to that same thing. On the reduction side of things, trying to zip through this because I know we're getting close to the first hour of stream and I want to come back and play more Final Fantasy. So, public health approaches to mitigating stigma. Many years of research on anti-stigma interventions have found that successful interventions include contact. In person, the video can be a feature if done correctly, yeah. Creating space, social avenues, outlets, interventions that focus on a range of disorders, not just depression or mental illness broadly. Involve participation. I mean, that speaks to just customized, individualized planning in general, which all of us would appreciate in our healthcare. Involve participation of people with lived experience. Target groups that have the most interaction or where lack of help seeking is most problematic for those who are young and still developing, undocumented communities, military communities. Those affected, and this is where, the Men's Mental Health Month component comes in. Those who were taught, the pull yourself up by your bootstraps type of coping skill that works until it doesn't, or that somehow misattribute. I don't say somehow. We understand how this system develops, but the problematic means of social masking, and social masking as machismo, bravado, and thinking that it's not considered masculine to be vulnerable or develop emotional IQ or go to therapy, or follow and engage problematically with social media users who think it's funny to say dumbass shit like, never went to therapy, put it on my grave, bruh. That becomes a problem over time, even if they socially identify and that's their in-group. socially identify with those people and that's their in-group, they're still persons who need help because they were woefully misled about what they attach their cultural identity to. Substantial research shows that knowing or having contact with someone with mental illness is one of the best ways to reduce stigma. Individuals speaking out and sharing stories that can have a positive impact. Individuals speaking out and sharing their stories can have a positive impact, excuse me. When we know someone with mental illness, it becomes less scary and more real and relatable. Teens are searching for health information online, and mental health issues are among the top searches. According to a national survey from Hope Lab in 2021, about 4 in 10 teens say they have looked for people with similar health concerns. Many celebrities such as Demi Lovato, The Rock, Michael Phelps, Taraji P. Henson, and Lady Gaga have publicly shared their stories of mental health challenges and brought the discussion into more general media and everyday conversation, which is great. And to compare that to what was this study from like a few months ago we talked about? It was like 40 to 60% of information from like mental health influencers on social media was misleading or outright incorrect, created for the clicks. Which then means if you're involved with, providing psychoeducation to someone in this flock, or really anybody, it's worth asking them like, hey, where are you hearing this? Where are you getting this information? Because unfortunately there are some who I'm not against self-diagnosing. I'm against self-diagnosing if someone is being fed information for clicks that worsens pathology and doesn't give them access to hope and healing and change and motivation to do so. It's worth asking what sources they like for their education and entertainment, and then maybe review that with them to qualify what they're seeing, and then you can give them some feedback if they're open to that. Researchers found that intervention was particularly... Wait, what intervention? One study tracked more than 700 students across 2 years in a randomized controlled trial and found that watching videos of people sharing their personal experiences and videos with information on mental health improved students' mental health care. Researchers found that the intervention was particularly effective for those in need, enabling them to recognize their need for care and behave accordingly. I also think that speaks to a lot of us in the Twitch community, where, it's not uncommon to talk about one's journey and getting diagnosed or self-directing towards personal questionnaires that may be associated with reinforcing one's suspicion they may be neurodivergent. A lot of those access points are created through online communities. It especially helps where someone had a window into an opportunity who have felt safe to approach that and see how others were exchanging resources that were helpful to them. Social marketing campaigns can also be effective. A research study looked at the effectiveness of an anti-stigma social marketing campaign in California and found that the campaign increased service use of helping people better understand symptoms of distress and increasing awareness that help is available. Oh look, Collins did the research here. Thank you, Collins. The researchers, he was lead author. Researchers suggest that widespread exposure to that mental health campaign could significantly increase access to treatment, which is ultimately what we want. We want access points, curiosity. We don't want to gatekeep. We want to remove the barriers to care. Of course, we want something like Medicare for all, too. And look at other things we can do to help. Talking openly about mental health, psychoeducation, a little psychoeducation goes a long way to making a meaningful difference. Said it before, we'll say it 1,000,001 more times. You do not have to be a mental health professional to have a therapeutic value in your own or someone else's life. And again, a little psychoeducation can go a long way to making a positive impact. Show compassion for those with mental illness, be honest about treatment, normalize seeking it, Let the media know. Let the media know when they're using stigmatizing language, presenting stories of mental illness in a stigmatizing way. I would say call out persons who use problematic verbiage, like referring to a group of persons making poor decisions as autistic or retarded. I'm not too keen on that verbiage ramping up in the zeitgeist again. I would say cut the shit when you see it. It ain't cool, never was. Choose empowerment over shame. I fight stigma by choosing to live an empowered life. To me, that means owning my life and my story and refusing to allow others to dictate how I view myself or how I feel about myself. According to that user. My favorite celebrity, Lady Gaga. They or them. There are an abundance of resources at the end of this article if you are curious to review them and share that. And I'm going to drop this in here too, just because I mentioned it earlier. It's an easy model that references cognitive behavioral therapy. Helps create a visualization for, sometimes refer to it as like ABC, the action, the behavior, the cognition. In this case, the thought, the emotion, the behavior, and remembering that this is just another tool that you can use for like mindfulness practice to separate yourself from a feeling, what you can notice when something's coming up, and how you can maybe modify that before it becomes aligned with the behavior. So often that once you reach the behavioral point, the behavior reinforces the thought. It's not the thought that reinforces the behavior, if that makes sense. You can have all the negative cognitions and intrusive thoughts and automatic thoughts that you want, but until you act on them, there's no mechanism of reinforcing that. Which maybe that's helpful to hear. For me, I like having some visualization to connect the dots there. So there's one of hundreds, which is slightly cut off there, but it's there. All right, I think we coming up on time for me to take a break. We are. All right, I'm gonna take a break. When we come back, video game. Thank you all for the side chat portion of stream. I will, if I remember to, I'll trim this and drop it on YouTube for later review. And yeah, I'm gonna take a break. It's the moment when I encourage you all emphatically to scan your body meats from your toes to your tingles and identify what sensory needs you have to meet. Turn towards those and give yourself what you need. If I can remain a part of your dopamine menu for the evening, thank you. I will see you in 3,